Hi, everybody. My name is not David Martin Davies. I am Yvette Benavides, and I'm so happy to be here with Rye Curtis and Fiona King Foster for Unexpected Detours, Stories of Women Who Survive. For starters, I want to say thank you for being here. I know there are so many fantastic panels going on alongside this one, and I'm so glad that you're here to celebrate books and literature and literacy, and in particular, these two novels. We'll be talking to Rye and to Fiona. If you have not done so already, be sure to consider purchasing the novels Kingdomtide and The Captive through the book festival independent bookseller Nowhere Books. The pandemic has affected us all so much, and it's also affected book sales for independent booksellers. So we would appreciate it very much if you would consider purchasing your books from Nowhere Books. If you have a question for our authors, please use the chat, and we'll collect those at the end of the session, and we'll be sure and try to get those answered for you. I want to talk to you a little bit about our authors. Rye Curtis is originally from Amarillo, Texas, and he's a graduate of Columbia University and lives on a ranch in Texas, and Kingdomtide is his first novel. Fiona King Foster was raised in the rural community of Brudenell, Ontario, and her writing has appeared in The Globe and Mail, Hobart, Room, Midway Journal, and many other journals. She lives in Toronto and works with the national literacy organization Frontier College, and The Captive is her first novel. So thank you both for being here. I want to do something that I feel strongly about doing. I want to read the back cover and the inside flap of summaries of these books. I think there's an art to this kind of writing that just grabs readers, and sometimes this is all we have to lead us into a book. And when I read the summaries of these novels, I had to dive right in. So I'll just read a portion of this one. So this is for The Captive. In a secessionist rural state that has cut itself off completely from urban centers, where living is hard scrabble and poor but free, Brooke runs a farm with her husband Milo and 2 daughters. Their life at the fringes of modern society is tenuous, yet Brooke cherishes the loving, peaceful life they have carved out for themselves. She has even begun to believe she is free from the violent history she has kept a secret from her family. But when escaped criminal Stephen Cawley attacks at the farm, Brooke's buried talents surface, and she quickly and harshly subdues him. She is convinced that he has come in retribution for the blood feud she thought she escaped years ago. She sets out to bring Cawley to justice, planning to use the bounty on his head to hide her family far from danger. Fearing that other members of Cawley's infamous family will soon descend, Brooke insists Milo and the girls flee with her, traveling miles on foot across an unforgiving landscape. And hilarity ensues. I mean, it's a page turner, to say the least. Here's the back cover summary of Kingdomtide. The sole survivor of a plane crash, 72-year-old Cloris Waldrop is lost and alone in the unforgiving wilderness of Montana's rugged Bitterroot Range, exposed to the elements with no tools beyond her wits and ingenuity. Intertwined with her story is the tale of Deborah Lewis, a park ranger struggling with addiction and a recent divorce, who was galvanized by her mission to find and rescue Cloris. As Cloris wanders mountain forests and valleys, that is 72-year-old Cloris Waldrop, subsisting on whatever she can scavenge, her hold on life ever more precarious, Ranger Lewis and her motley group of rescuers follow the trail of clues she's left behind. Days stretch into weeks, and hope begins to fade. But with nearly everyone else giving up, Ranger Lewis stays true until the end, and it continues. But that should give folks in our audience an idea, if they haven't yet read the novels, of what is going on with these strong women who survive. I did ask our authors to read just a short snippet of their choice, so they're going to share that with us, and then we'll have a discussion. Fiona, do you want to go first?
Certainly. Thank you, Yvette. That was a great idea and lovely. Oh, and this is, for anyone who's curious about covers, this is the Canadian cover of The Captive.
Aha. This is...
Yeah, there's a hot debate between those two. All right, so the portion I'm going to read is from the prologue, and it's Yvette set up that Brooke, our hero, is in fear of her life from this fugitive, Stephen Colley. So the scene in the prologue is the moment that she first sees the warrant for his arrest. The page was dominated by the fugitive's face, fair-haired, blue-eyed, a scar from his lip to his chin. On charges of murder, the paper warned, felony escape, traffic of controlled substances, incitement to violence, destruction of federal property. Last known address, Shaw Station. The noise of the auction receded. Brooke's hands tingled and her pulse beat forcefully in her temples. She noticed she wasn't breathing, drew in a jagged lungful of air. A memory of pain, darkness, her own voice screaming, "Run." Holly and Sal were at the farm, alone and unprotected. Brooke pictured them as they'd been that morning when she and Milo left for town. Sal's slack, sleepy hug. Holly arguing right up to the last about being left behind to watch her little sister. Brooke and Star could be there in an hour if they rode hard. The thought of Star introduced a new fear. The horse's brand was old and faint, but unmistakable, enough to expose them to anyone who came looking. Brooke laid a hand on Milo's sleeve to get his attention, and he broke off the conversation he was having with someone on his other side. "I have to go," Brooke said. "What is it?" Milo asked, concerned. "200 on sugar," she said, already turning away. "Max." She hurried through the crowd to the public stables. Star was drowsing in her stall. Brooke reached over the gate and grazed the mare's velvet-soft muzzle with her fingers. Star blinked and pushed Brooke's hand gently, steaming damp breath into the palm. Brooke ran her hand down Star's neck to the shoulder, where the old brand showed through her half-grown winter coat. 2 thin vertical lines, bisected by a hook. It had been done flat-faced and superficially, just enough to prevent the hair follicles from regrowing back when Star was a foal. Covering it would require more aggressive scarring. "I have to do something, girl." Brooke pulled her hand away, hoping Star could not sense the anxiety in her touch. It had to be done and fast. The harness shop in town was unscrupulous about off-auction horse trades. Star was the only thing Brooke had taken with her 15 years ago, the closest thing she had to a friend. She would tell Milo simply that the mare's years were starting to tell. Star was pushing 18, and it made sense to sell her while they could still get something. It had never felt good to lie to Milo, but Brooke knew he wouldn't question her. He was accustomed to her reticence, and now wasn't the time for her to offer up any more complicated explanation. She had to go. She would tell him she was sorry about their overnight, but she didn't want the girls left alone with a fugitive on the loose. That wasn't unreasonable. The Collies were notorious even here. Brooke removed her scarf and looped it around Star's neck, knotting the fabric behind the horse's ears. She poured oats into the improvised feed bag, and as Star munched, Brooke backed the horse into the corner of the stall where the gate hinged. She unlatched the gate and roped it across the mare's chest, wedging her in so she couldn't move. Then she rummaged through a heap of implements leaning against the stable wall until she found what she was looking for: 2 long-handled claw cultivators with iron tines. There was a fire burning in the small wood stove. She opened the door and propped one of the claws over the coals. Brooke took the other claw over to the stall and touched it to Star's brand. Star brought her head up, watched Brooke's face, and then returned to her oats. Brooke withdrew the cold iron for a moment, then placed it on the brand again. She did this 4 times until the horse took no more notice of the metal and kept eating. Brooke moved swiftly to the stove. She had to be quick if she expected to get the proceeds into Milo's hands before the auction reached livestock. Anything under 10 years old, she'd tell him, that could pull machinery and be trusted with the kids. He could meet her at home with the new horse, the sugar, and the rest of their supplies. Brooke didn't intend to wait. The weekly truck carrying tar sands workers up the mountain road left in the afternoon, and she planned to be on it. Its route traveled right past the farm, and the driver would make room if she paid. The claw in the stove was hot. Near its iron collar, the wooden handle was charred and glowing, not yet burned through. Brooke lifted it and hurried back to Star. "I'm sorry, girl," she whispered, as she threaded the hot tines between the planks of the stall to cover Star's brand. Star flinched and tried to heave herself away, but she was wedged in tight by the roped gate. Brooke pressed the searing metal, sizzling and smoking, into Star's shoulder for 5 seconds, and then it was over. She was no one's now.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And Rye, would you read a short excerpt from your book?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is just going to be from the opening chapter, just a portion of it. Cloris and her husband are on a plane ride to Montana from Texas to have a little vacation. I no longer pass judgment on any man nor woman. People are people, and I do not believe there is much more to be said on the matter. 20 years ago, I might have been of a different mind about that, but I was a different Cloris Waldrop back then. I might have gone on being that same Cloris Waldrop, the one I had been for 72 years, had I not fallen out of the sky in that little airplane on Sunday, August 31st, 1986. It does amaze that a woman can reach the tail end of her life and find that she hardly knows herself at all. I sat by the window, and my dear husband, Mr. Waldrop, sat on my right. He had his hands busy fiddling with a ragged cuticle. My husband was a kind, bird-faced man, and he wore strong glasses. He was born in Amarillo, Texas, to an awning salesman and a midwife. I first ever laid eyes on him in the summer of 1927 at a county dance in the town hall. This was after his family had moved to some 60 miles east from the big, noisy boomtown of Amarillo to little old Clarendon, where I was born and raised. He was a terribly handsome boy, tall and dark-haired. However, he wore a little blue cap that made him look mighty silly. We were both only kids. I had just turned 13. He gave me a pitifully wilted rose he had stolen from Mrs. McKee's garden. On that morning in August of 1986, he had a dab of jalapeno jelly on his chin. It had been there since our complimentary breakfast at the Big Sky Motel in Missoula, Montana. I was going to tell him to use the handkerchief I had embroidered with his initials and had given him so many Christmases ago, but he had already begun for the pilot a monologue on rainfall. Such was his custom with men he had just met. Mr. Waldrop had arranged for us to take a scenic flight to an airfield near a cabin we had rented in the Bitterroot National Forest. The pilot he had hired was a strong, well-groomed young man by the name of Terry Squime. Terry was not a hair over 30 and was newly wed. He showed us a photograph of his bride. She was pretty and resembled Catherine Drewer, a rude and frustrating brunette woman I had knew from our church, the First Methodist. Only Mrs. Squime was quite some years younger and had a jaw less like a shoehorn and a nose less like an old mushroom. When I would later come to know Mrs. Squime, whom I have cautioned against reading certain passages of this account, I would find her to be a pleasant and selfless young woman and to be very little like Catherine Drewer at all. Mr. Waldrop carried on about rainfall and the nuisance of beavers, and I returned to looking out my little window. The Cessna 340 is a little twin-propeller airplane of 6 seats, and ours had taken off from an airfield outside of Missoula and was flying south over the Bitterroot Mountains. I mean to tell you, these are mountains, the kind that remind a person, no matter how old they are, that they are infinitely young to the earth. These mountains are edged and scalloped like gigantic kin to the arrowheads my little brother Davy, God rest his tiny soul, unearthed in Paladura Canyon when we were small. I had lived 72 years in the Texas Panhandle, and mountains are not a geological feature you will find in that country. The land is as flat can be, level with what is level in the constitution and spirit of the people who walk it. We plains folk are a grounded people and rarely see a mountain. But having seen what I have now seen of them, when I say these were mountains, you would be right to believe me. I was then 54 years married to Mr. Waldrop. We lived in a little brick ranch house in the orbital shade of a municipal water tower that serviced the some 2,000 thirsty souls in Clarendon. Only the day before, we had locked up the front door and had taken the truck to the airport in Amarillo, where we had then flown with a quick stop in Denver to Missoula on a jet airplane. We did not often venture far from our little house, and this was to be the first trip we had taken in a good long while. We had spent the first night of it under a full moon in the Big Sky Motel off I-90, an establishment with damp carpets and laminate wood. Mr. Waldrop was not a poor man, but neither was he an extravagant man. I had come to terms with this early on in our marriage. Mr. Waldrop hesitated half a second on the subject of rain gauges, and Terry took the opportunity to ask how long we were planning to stay in Montana. Just a few days, Mr. Waldrop said. Our pastor and his wife had the best time up here. Figured we'd get ourselves a cabin, do some fishing, and kick back. But we sure need to get back this coming Thursday. Mr. Waldrop likes to pretend he is not retired, I said. Terry looked back. What kind of work do you do, sir? I bought a cattle ranch in '45. We sold it a year ago, September. Well, I bet you two will have a great time up here, Terry said. We're counting on it, Mr. Waldrop said, and he pulled the cuticle from his thumb. A point of blood rose on the nail, and he staunched it on his blue jeans. Doing Mr. Waldrop's laundry, you might come across several pairs of blue jeans peppered with blood like that. If you did not know him, you could mistake him for a fighting man. But the only physical altercation I ever recall him having was with a mean old possum that had got itself snagged on a nail under our porch. Mr. Waldrop had his small ways of fidgeting. I suppose it was the result of his mind always being a few steps ahead of the rest of him, quick as he was, and it made him nervous trying to catch up. Did you work, Mrs. Waldrop? Terry asked. I had taught English in elementary school and was the librarian for 44 years, and I told him so. I retired 2 years ago, I said. Now we only got time for relaxing, said Mr. Waldrop, patting my knee. Any kids? Terry said. Never did get around to it, Mr. Waldrop said. I turned back to my little window. The blue sky and the pane gave back my reflection. It reminded me of the oval portrait of my great-grandmother, June Polyander, which had hung over her bed until she had passed away in her 90s. I fixed my hair. I wore it like many of the ladies at First Methodist. Permed up, we called it. When I was a young woman, it had been the color of love grass in winter, and I had worn it longer then. It started going gray in my 40s. The grayer and whiter it went, the more Mr. Waldrop said I looked like a dandelion going to seed. I have never been a great beauty. My nose is too much like a man's to earn that appellation. But I have always done my best to be presentable. A spiky-haired woman named Lucille Carver came to church often as not looking like she had been fired there out of a cannon. I never could understand why she would let herself out of the house like that. I had always supposed it had to do with a disrespect for worship and a disregard for femininity, but now I'm not so sure. That warm Sunday in August, I wore a pleated tan skirt and a white blouse, and I was carrying my nice leather purse. I am mighty glad now that I was also wearing my most comfortable pair of walking shoes. I suppose women like me are a phenomenon of the past. In Dallas, I saw a young woman with long, screwy, unwashed hair hold a restaurant door for a man. I thought at the time this young woman was without a sense of decorum and propriety. However, I think now she was a sign of the times, maybe something good and new of the future. I spent my entire life with women to whom I felt akin, sitting in the fourth pew from the front at First Methodist. I know that each of them have had their hardships and have suffered one way or another. Mary Martha had been born with an odd-shaped kidney that did not work the way it ought to and caused her much pain and turned the whites in her eyes the color of egg yolk. Sarah May lost her little boy in an accident involving a tire swing, and Mabry Cartwright never married, being that her teeth might as well have been wood chips and her breath the wind over a feedlot. I do not know how my trials and tribulations tally against those of any of these women. We do not know anyone's suffering but our own. However, I do sometimes wonder if any of them could have survived the Bitterroot.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I think both of those excerpts are so revealing about these characters. I mean, obviously, here we are in a session called Unexpected Detours, Stories of Women Who Survive. So, spoiler alert, they survive. But how they manage, there's the rub. There's this incredible story for us. So now we know from the captive a little bit about Brooke, and a little bit about the setting. And in Kingdomtide, we know a little bit about Chloris, and we know a little bit about where she's from and where they're headed. So I feel like there's such a compression here, but then that you all manage so many details for us, and we're really right in there. But what I think is so interesting is the way that, well, I'll just say it, the way you treat the notion of the detour. So that implies that we're sort of bopping along, you know, this established, expected path, and then there's a, you know, earth out from under you moment, right? This some divergence that's not expected. So the detour, you know, sort of becomes the issue. So I wanted to say that because I just, it's such a coincidence though that it, you know, it sort of occurs in both, but then these are the moments where these women have to act. So I'm going to ask Rye, there's some very idiosyncratic characters in your book, and reviewers have commented on a kind of David Lynch feeling, which I suppose is one way to describe them, but I'll be honest with you, and I don't know what this says about me, but they were so realistically drawn and so reminiscent of people that I feel like I know. I mean, every single one of them. So first of all, how do you feel about this idea regarding the denizens of the world that you created, sort of being put in this kind of league of, it's not really surreal, it's just sort of like this near surreal, but it's not, it's almost like too real. And maybe we can start with Chloris, but there's Ranger Lewis, and there's Claude, there's Pete, there's Jill, there's Blore. But just what is the idea there? And if you want to talk about Chloris or maybe one of the other characters.
Well, I'm glad you said that they felt real. Thank you. That's kind of, to me, what, you know, I'm just interested in characters like that, I think. And they tend to ring more true to me than characters that in fiction try to approximate reality too much or worry about that as a kind of construct that you have to constantly approach when you're writing fiction. I would rather write ridiculous characters because somehow, to me, they always feel like they're more authentic and fun. And I also, that's just kind of the tone that I wanted to achieve, is that it is, you know, depending on how you read it, it does feel surreal, but that line between surrealism and reality is fairly blurred in our day-to-day life anyway. So, I mean, if you just look around, it seems like a bizarre fever dream anyway. So, you know, I think to me, it just functions as an interesting tool, you know.
How do those characters emerge? I mean, are they also based on people you've seen around or that you know? You know, I'm thinking about like each of the idiosyncratic qualities that each character has, and again, it doesn't defy logic or believability to you know, trace some of these characters and their descriptions, they're very real. So I read the David Lynch thing and I thought I don't see it, not at all.
I don't mind that comparison too much, but I do. I think these characters are. I think when you're writing fiction, necessarily all your characters are an amalgamation of people and encounters that you've had, even not even assigned to any specific person. But of course, so they are all kind of puppets from my imagination assimilating all these people that I know, and some of them have very distinct references in my personal life, but none of them are any one person, and I think that's important, at least for when I try and write anything. It's hard to, if I were to try and, even if I were writing something that were nonfiction, I think even nonfiction writers do this, possibly to their detriment in some cases, or maybe not. I don't know if it's avoidable, but you create versions of everyone in your mind anyway throughout your entire life. In reality, we're constantly creating characters of the people that we interact with. So in much of the same way, all of these people are just fictionalized accounts of everyone that I've ever known, so.
Well, something that I appreciate is that some of the details are coming through the lens of Cloris. Not in the Ranger Lewis chapters, right, with the close third person, but with the first person narration of Cloris. And so you really get to hear, I mean, sometimes, about these other women from First Methodist, she's a little a little ruthless, a little too, but otherwise you really are getting also a sense of her. This occurred to her on this trip in the 80s when she was in her 70s, and she's telling the story years on. And so you see how, you can hear how she has been transformed by the experience and sort of comes to a kind of a reckoning about how she looks at the world, or used to think about, the internet or young people and things like that. So I just have such a profound appreciation for this idea of the way that fiction tells a truer truth sometimes than something a story that because it actually happened. This thing about nonfiction being stranger than fiction, or somehow more interesting than fiction because it happened. But I feel like in fiction, it's kind of the same diff, right? It's sort of like these things have happened somewhere. These things are, as you said, they're an amalgamation of that. Well, Fiona, as I was reading The Captive, I was thinking, oh, Fiona eats chia pudding, or oh, Fiona knows a lot about horses. So I was sort of like trying to separate, right, the nonfiction, but actually your character of Brooke, I kept thinking she's got to be somebody that you've created, I don't know, from whole cloth, or is she also sort of an amalgam of people that you've known? She's a force.
She's a force, all right. Yeah. I am not a lot like Brooke in personality, but she is definitely based on me. Mostly as a wild overextension, over dramatization of the things that were going through my mind when I started this book and when she kind of came into being, which was a very tumultuous time. And a lot of the things, coming from a very rural backwoods upbringing, living for now many, many years in a big city, I hold a certain amount of tension all the time between where I come from and where I ended up. And in the last, maybe forever, but certainly in my political awareness in the last 5 years or so, that has ramped up to a degree that's become almost unbearable. And I started this book in 2016, and it was feeling pretty unbearable. And I had a lot of anxiety and a lot of tension and a lot of anger, frankly. And that's where she came from. So, you know, the way she behaves and moves through the world is like one tiny shard of how I might feel on the inside blown into this, you know, thriller landscape with an action hero. You know, I'm not an action hero. But there are times when I would like to be. You know. Does that answer your question?
It does, but at the same time, you know, I didn't think of her like, you know, a Sarah Connor kind of character. Not at all. I mean, I felt like she's very realistic too. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's so palpable in every single scene with Brooke. It's sort of like the tension, the anger, the emotion, the sorrow, the anxiety. I mean, it is. She's always sort of about to explode, and it's because she's either protecting her secret or she's protecting her family and her future. And so it's believable for that. You know, I kept going through the story and thinking, well, oh my gosh, what would I do? And, you know, and this is sort of set in the future, in the near future, I'd say, but it's, you can sort of see this, who would she have been had she not encountered these things in her young life? And that's a very hard thing to figure out. And then I feel like, well, she is exactly who she is. And I don't really feel like you've overplayed it either. I mean, I do feel like in certain situations, we do, women and everybody, you know, we would have to do that for our own protection or the protection of the people that we love. You both write so beautifully about the natural landscape, and it's a kind of writing that I've been studying personally on a much smaller scale. I've been doing a little bit of reading about writers and gardening, right? And just lately, but I've read recently The Lowering Days by Gregory Brown. I read Kristen Hanna's The Four Winds. Gabriel Byrne's memoir, Walking with Ghosts, really goes to the natural landscape of his childhood. And so, and also another nonfiction book is Jonathan Meiberg's the book about the Caracara, the most remarkable creature. The writing, and I keep looking at it and studying it. And so in these two novels, it was a kind of a different experience for me because I could really just immerse myself in it and study it. I'm as I said, I'm really drawn to that type of writing. But what is it that moves each of you, and Fiona, if you don't mind going first, to the natural landscape? And I have several sections that I've written out from your book, but what is it? I think it takes a real skill and a talent, but then I also feel like, no, it just must come so organically and so naturally based on your experience. But how is that for you, that kind of writing? Is it something you enjoy? Is it just something that's just part of your world as a writer?
Thank you for those kind words. I'm really dying to hear what Rye has to say, because I'll go out on a limb and say I suspect it's going to be something similar, but just based on Kingdomtide. But for me, it's like, honestly, that is just where I'm comfortable. That's just my vocabulary. That is what is easiest for me to write.
Wow.
It's like comfort food. If you could get away with writing a book of just natural descriptions, I would probably try. But obviously, that would be pretty boring. And I love getting into characters and I love getting into story, but the falling back, it feels almost like falling back into natural description is, that's where I breathe. Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, it's just so lovely in this book, and but as I said, I feel like it's really not something every writer can do, not by a long shot. It seems like. Okay, so we want to hear from Rye then, right, Fiona? I want to hear
do.
what Rye.
I'm ready to be wrong, but I'm so curious.
Well, thanks. I think it's just kind of, as Fiona said, it does just happen naturally, and it would be fun to just write a lot of descriptions. I guess that could be poetry, probably, in some cases. But no,
Sure.
I grew up a lot of the time out in the country in Texas, and so I just have a lot of vivid images that are kind of carried with me since then. So I enjoy finding places that they might come out into what I'm writing. It's interesting because Montana, isn't Texas, and so I liked having this idea that having somebody from Texas be thrown in the midst of a pretty different landscape. And so that was fun for me to get to imagine in kind of a hyper real sort of way what that would be like descriptively.
Yeah, and again, even through the lens of Cloris's point of view, and I compared the writing there, the writing of the natural landscape, and at a certain point, I felt like the Cloris wasn't so far removed, or she reaches a point where she doesn't feel so far removed from it. I want to talk about mortality and morality in these novels. So the protagonists here face their mortality, but morality it's not like a foregone conclusion, even if they think they're about to meet their maker, right? Here's something that Cloris Waldrop says. The stages of grief are myriad, and you could not endeavor to name them all. A stage for every recollection, for every ever-failing memory, and these stages are nameless and they are many, so that cast before you is a measureless spectrum of unparticular nostalgia and loss. Grief is the cold end of the night, I believe. So what I like about this quote, beyond its profound beauty, is how it connects to this super basic idea, right, of Frank O'Connor's The Lonely Voice, that all stories are about loss. And we see the ways that the women in these novels manage so much loss, and how they come face to face with the conflict of, woman against nature, or against, these other really insidious forces. But what we also find here that I appreciate very much is that they don't use the experience from the vantage point of moralizing at that point, right? So both women, in really surprising ways, point to the fact that there's not like this binary of a good guy and a bad guy. Like there's some really blurred lines in the characters in these books. No one is all good or all bad, and they recognize it, and it becomes part of their of a burden, I would say, but also of, at a certain point, something that's very liberating for them, and I think allows them to do the things that they must do, or end up not fighting their feelings about another character. So that I just kept thinking, like, there's such an interesting interplay between mortality and morality. So I don't know, Fiona, how do you think about this idea of the way that Brooke isn't isn't the superhero, isn't the good guy, against the black-hatted bad guy. How do you see that?
That's a excellent and difficult question.
We're just chatting.
The ambiguity is just so important to me. And I put Brooke in this world that's in many ways a Western, and kind of a dystopian Western, because both of those genre worlds rely on real absolutes. You know, the traditional Western, it's deeply moral and simplistically so a lot of the time. I mean, obviously that has traveled, but traditionally.
Sure.
And then dystopian fiction tends to look at a worst case scenario outcome for some cultural or environmental fear that we have, as if like there's no in between ground, like there's no road between whatever the thing, the anxiety that we have and the, you know, the Armageddon that it leads to. And I wanted to press on those things, so I put her in that kind of a world, and I made her ambiguous morally and ethically, because I just think that's more interesting. And I'm just tired of easy answers in fiction. You know, I want something else. And you know, certainly the best writing advice I've ever heard is to write the book that you want to read. And that's why. Yeah, I agree. She's a jerk and does some terrible, reprehensible things. But she's also just a human being who's trying to figure out what to do with what she has. And that I can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, she's totally relatable for that very reason.
I'm glad you think so.
No, yeah, and I appreciate it in Rye's book too. Cloris tells us what she thinks we might assume about someone from her generation or her upbringing, might believe about someone like the hermit, the man that she's lost with. Well, he's not lost. The man that she's with in the wilderness for a time. No spoilers. Or many others in this cavalcade of characters from back home that she's recalling. And she says, quote, "Without you having lived through something like that, I do not believe you will ever understand. I do not believe that I can describe it. What I will put down here is that I have found that morality is not the anchor of goodness. Morality is not the anchor of goodness. And that a person is too many things to be the one thing that we all want them to be for our convenience."
Mm-hmm.
That's the tattoo. No. So same idea as what Fiona just shared with us, but now with Cloris. And I feel like Ranger Lewis will get there in due time. But can you talk about that same idea with the character of Cloris?
Yeah, I think that it is, morality is just confusing, and the relativity of all of it is fascinating to me, because, you know, as Fiona mentioned, these absolutes that we use to structure traditional stories, you know, we use to structure everything, or usually everything that we perceive in our lives. And I think I wanted Cloris to have to come to terms with that and dismantle these notions about absolutism with regard to good and evil, and finding that it seems almost everyone, to some varying degree of fault, is abused and an abuser. You know, we're all just at fault in some way or another, and I think that she has to kind of think about that quite a bit. And it's not easy, and it's complicated, and there are no easy answers, and that's what I think is interesting about it. And to a degree, you kind of have to come to terms with that at some point. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to survive, not in the literal sense always, but within society. It's difficult to have interpersonal relationships if we can't cut people some slack and realize that the thing that joins us is this sense of that we're all fallible, humans. Just we're creatures of humanity that are going to constantly make mistakes. And so I think that that's what she has to come to terms with, because she's from a place that is very entrenched in this moralistic paradigm, this Calvinistic, black and white moral paradigm. And that is not at all how the real world is. But most people, it seems, in the world, everyone has to get by trying to think that's the way it is. But it falls apart. So
there is something about her narration, and of course she's telling the story years later, but there is something about her narration early on that feels like she's still very much in that world with Mr. Waldrop. And by the way, speaking of, we really know people. I know a woman who refers to her husband as Mr. So-and-so. She does not refer to him by, yeah. And so anyway, so that idea of how she comes to she shows us sort of more and more. I think it enlarges as we go through this idea of coming to an understanding. And I'll use the example, it seems kind of silly, but I'll use the example of her relative Jessica that stares at the internet, stares at the computer. But then later, Cloris comes to terms with the idea, right? There's just a beauty in that ambiguity. There's just a beauty in this idea of, as you said, admitting, understanding, putting out there that we really are all flawed. We all are deeply flawed people. And so when we see that in literature and it's not sanitized and it's not, cut neatly in half, it makes total sense. So I want to ask you one more question, and I'm mindful of the time here, but let me see I wrote them down because I wanted to be sure and ask them, and now I'm not sure where they are. There's this, Rye, Cloris lived through this traumatic survival event, and she alludes to the ideas about how humans are destroying the planet and don't care about, course correcting, even as we know what the issues are and how we contribute to them. And this idea is in your book too, Fiona. For Brooke, it seems the idea of survival is so tied to how deeply rooted she is to the land. I started to mark the places, and there were many in your book, Fiona. Here's one. Brooke closed her eyes and summoned the calm place, cool humidity, a misty forest. The trees were so dark against the wash of stars, they looked like they had been cut out of the sky. And then elsewhere, the only sounds as they wound through the hills were the thick-grown trees rustling around them, the high drone of summer insects, and Start's shoes on the road. So her survival skills are what they are because of the deep knowledge that she has. And what's so interesting to me is that, as this is said in the near future, I wonder how she, and then also Rye for you, how you consider the idea of global warming and climate change. Cloris alludes to it, I think, in a very pointed way, but I also see it, Fiona, in Brooke's story. So I don't know who wants to grab the question first.
Fiona? Climate change?
Yeah, climate change is something it's one of those things that is so present in my daily awareness that I almost don't know how to write about it.
Sure.
And as we talked about before, I do end up writing a lot about the natural world, and I do come from the north, and climate change is happening very quickly in the
Sure.
north, and undeniably, I would say. Um, and I don't, I don't know that it affects my writing in any way that I could point
Mm-hmm.
to.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would be writing about the natural world regardless. Um, I guess I would just say that I do sometimes worry that um, I worry over the question of what writers can do
I see.
about such
Yeah.
global threats.
Yeah.
I'm not really answering your question. It's
No,
something that
you are.
tears me up, to be quite honest, and I don't know how to talk about it in writing.
Yeah. I feel like it's so present in your work. I mean, I do feel like there's this implicit connection that, and I think that's the answer. I mean, I don't know. I just see it's so much a part of who she is that it does seem like it's there. Like, just look, it's there.
I would like to think that the more you nurture your connection with the non-human natural world, the less likely you are to want to destroy it. But I'm not sure that that's
Oh, yeah.
borne out. You know, it seems like the things that are driving climate change aren't personal as much as
Hmm.
economic.
I hear that. I hear you. I
I
understand
don't
what
have
you mean.
I don't have a solid answer to that one.
No, but I understand exactly what you're saying.
Mhm.
And Rye, I think from Cloris's point of view, we do get a little bit of just her awareness, and that she mentions it.
Well, yeah, she's realizing that even beyond climate change, she's just envisioning an entire degradation of everything toward the
Yeah.
end. I mean, I think that she's just seeing how, just it's culture becomes increasingly baffling to her, and as well the culture of disregard for, threats against humanity, um, and cultural disregard for, I guess, sincerity and everything like that doesn't help stave off climate change. I think that she's just kind of disillusioned with the way people work, and so that is tied in with how they would be able to help the world survive a future of irreparable damage.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We do. I'm mindful of the time. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to read them both, and you can choose the one you want to answer. So Lily has asked, is there a specific poem or book or essay that you turn to when you are feeling particularly unmotivated or stuck? That's one question. And in the interest of time, I'll read the other question. Can you talk a little bit about how the past year has impacted your writing process? And did you find yourself avoiding writing or turning to it more to cope? Either or both.
You
Fiona.
first, right?
Well, I guess my book, I don't really have a specific book, but I do. I mean, I just will read something that gets me excited every now and then about wanting to, press on. And I've recently, I've reread a book by Charles Portis called Masters of Atlantis, which has been one of my favorites for a long time, but it just kills me. And so I got all jazzed up reading that. And So
Good.
that, and then the other question, I guess, for me, avoiding writing over the year hasn't really happened, but it's just been harder. I mean, I think for everyone, it's just kind of strange, I mean, to say the least, this whole year.
Sure.
And I mean, I'm very grateful that I've been able to stay healthy and my family's been healthy and we've been, keeping okay. And that's, very lucky. And so I just keep getting, but, being separate from everyone and particularly out on a ranch in the middle of nowhere is just, it does kind of play tricks on your mind. So my writing has become pretty strange and angry and modeled. It's bonkers right now. So I think that's kind of the effect, and it's been hard to try and be as effective for some reason.
Well, thank you. How about you, Fiona?
Yeah, there are real practical hurdles to working creatively right now. My attention is so shot, and that, yeah, it's extra hard. But I'm sure everyone who writes knows that you're either going to do it or you're not. And to the extent that I can, I have kept writing, and that's, it's tough. It's tough to find the time. It's tough to find the quiet. I live in a house with 4 people, and 2 of them are very young, and that's challenging. I've been, worried about friends and family out there. Yeah, my attention has been the pits, but I have kept writing, and I've kept reading. Maybe more importantly, and to speak to the other question, that I don't have a one single thing that I go back to. I do reread certain texts over and over again, but the most reliable inspiration is to keep reading new things and different things, and as many different kinds of things as I can. I'm really omnivorous in my reading habits, and only more so with time. And I find that it's almost, it's how someone actually, Rye, if you don't know already, you probably do, but if you haven't read Jill Adamson, who's a Toronto writer, her new book came out this year, called Ridge Runner. I just know you would love it.
What's
and
it
everyone
called?
listening,
Ridge Runner?
It's called Ridge Runner, one word, by Jill Gil Adamson. It's a sequel to a previous novel. They're both fantastic. Anyways, look her up. But she, in an interview that I was watching online recently, said that writers read the way athletes eat, and that totally resonated with me. Like I find myself reaching for, I need this kind of thing. I need this kind of thing. I need, I'm filling myself with influences for whatever is obsessing my imagination at that time. So there.
Yeah, that's a great quote, because that does,
right?
It does feel you have to, that's really important, because you have to pay attention to what you're putting into your brain, you have to be really careful. So I find myself avoiding a lot of things as much as I find myself trying to find certain, I don't try and read a lot of certain things. So I, try and keep your head clear.
Well, in spite of the rocky start and the technical issues, I think, and I've said this to a couple of people, that I got I won the Moderator lottery, the book festival lottery, to be able to read these books. So Kingdomtide by Rye Curtis and The Captive by Fiona King Foster. If you haven't read these novels, do yourself a favor and read them. They are marvelous. I can't thank you both enough. Rye, thank you so much. And Fiona, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks. It was a delight.
It was so much fun for me. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Don't forget to buy books and support the book festival. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.